I think actually AI has really revolutionized, how we think about research. And I think we're just at the beginning of a wave of what is going to be research that is mainly driven by AI.
So one area is to come up with the ways, for example, using MRI to have subtypes of MS that better align with those underlying changes. The consequence of that is to have groups of patients that then we can use to match with future treatments.
And I think the reality is that many times when we create these models, when we execute AI, it's not clear exactly where a decision-making process may be coming from. And that might be unsettling both for a patient and for a clinician.
I'm Alan Thompson, Editor-in-Chief of the MS Journal. You're listening to the ECTRIMS podcast, a new sounding board for the MS research community, and the official podcast from the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS. Today's episode is part of the MS Journal Controversies in MS series. Today we are talking about the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, in multiple sclerosis research and clinical practice. I'm joined by two clinician scientists who have conducted research on this topic. Arman Eshaghi of the Queen Square Institute of Neurology, University College London, and Daniel Ontaneda of the Cleveland Clinic Neurological Institute's Mellen Center for Multiple Sclerosis in the United States. Artificial intelligence, or AI, represents a major technological advance that is revolutionizing the scientific research and practice of medicine. AI can be a powerful tool to help advance our understanding of the MS disease process, improve our diagnostic accuracy, better predict disease course, and identify optimal treatments. But how is AI being used in MS research currently? And what may it be able to do in the future? And I'd like now to turn to our experts and ask Arman. There's a lot of talk, but little clarity on AI. Let's start with your definition of artificial intelligence.
Many thanks, Alan, for having us. AI, or artificial intelligence, is a very broad term. It came into existence in the 1950s. So there's nothing really new about the term and its usage, but it refers to any sort of systems or technologies whose functions can resemble that of human intelligence. But more recently, the past 3-4 years, it usually in the public domain refers to the tools that understand language, that we refer to them as large language models. But as you mentioned, MS research, the application and the AI tools that are used are much wider.
Thanks for that. Dan, is there anything you'd like to add to this?
No, thanks so much, Alan, for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to join Arman and yourself in this very interesting conversation and discussion. One of the things that I think, happens when people talk about AI is there is somewhat of a fear of it kind of replacing the physician or replacing people in making decisions. And I think a term that I've recently heard that I like is, instead of artificial intelligence, the way we're actually using it is assistive intelligence. That is, you've got a friend in the room that's helping you make some decisions.
That's a very neat way of putting it, and it removes the threat and talks about the complementarity in a way, which is really, really, really neat. Can I just ask you, Dan, what novelties, if any, has AI already delivered to MS research?
Yeah, so I think actually AI has really revolutionized, how we think about research. And I think we're just at the beginning of a wave of what is going to be research that is mainly driven by AI. And I think the reason for this is multiple, but I think one of the things that has contributed to this is the large amount of data that we can now handle from our clinical care services, from clinical trials, from different devices. And then second, the increase in computing power that is now available all over the world that actually allows us to make machine learning and artificial intelligence a reality. And perhaps when thinking about research, I would like to focus 3 areas that probably where it's been, I think, the most helpful. I think one of those areas is how we use what patients are doing on a day-to-day basis and how we can incorporate that. And so all of us use computers, we use telephones, we use smartwatches, and a lot of that information that is stored in those devices can actually be garnered and used to generate insights about how multiple sclerosis might affect individuals. And we can compare individuals with MS with healthy individuals or individuals who have other neurologic conditions, and it really provides a great contrast. I think second, for me, and importantly, is how we use artificial intelligence in terms of processing images. This is an area that I work on specifically. MRI is something that has revolutionized MS and make that quite quantitative. And the ability of using artificial intelligence to analyze MRI images really takes it to the next level. In the past, you had to have people in a room drawing circles around lesions or measuring the size of the brain. I think one of the biggest kind of really clear achievements of AI that I've seen in my research is that we can do this now by running some code. We use artificial intelligence, and basically it's done almost semi-automatically. And I think finally, one of the kind of main kind of promises of AI is to actually make us design and execute clinical trials in a better way. In several other fields, this is already a reality. I think in MS, we're probably in the infancy, but definitely very promising.
We might come back to some of those examples in a minute. But Arman, what do you think? I mean, what added value can AI deliver to a field of research with more than 100 years of history?
So what we see in the past 10, perhaps 20 years, as Dan mentioned, is the accumulation of a lot of data for different reasons. So that doesn't necessarily go back to AI itself, but wherever in research, in MS, you see we have a huge amount of data. That's where the machine learning, I use machine learning rather than AI in this setting, can be used to derive patterns or discover things that are not easy for humans to understand. Again, for example, that would include, if we think about clinical care, the large amount of images or MRI that have been gathered over the many years, but that certainly is not really limited to just MRI. That includes a lot of lab results, but a lot of reports, for example, radiology reports, interaction with patients, conversations we have with patients in visits. So all those data, wherever you see an accumulation of data, is where AI and machine can excel and help patients.
I mean, can you think of examples within your own work where it's actually provided new insights that we didn't have before?
So one of the works we have been doing in a center at Queen Square is to try to come up with types of MS that better align with the underlying pathomechanism of the disease. As we know, we divide or subgroup patients into types based on how the MS course evolves over time. One of the areas, but that is very much based on the symptoms, and that may not necessarily be objective or may be very different across patients. So one area is to come up with the ways, for example, using MRI. Again, MRI is just one of the many ways that we can use AI, use MRI to have subtypes of MS that better align with those underlying changes. So that's just, I'm just scratching the surface of where AI, or we have been using it in the research we've had. And then what's the consequence of that is to have groups of patients that then we can use to match with future treatments. So match based on how a drug mechanisms, as opposed to having a one-size-fits-all approach for providing treatments.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So Dan, you mentioned drug clinical trials, and I just wondered how you think AI could help advance both drug design and clinical trials in MS, and particularly maybe in progressive MS.
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's several ways in which AI can be used to accelerate development of therapeutics for multiple sclerosis. And, embedded into this is clinical trials. And I think probably the first way is identification of compounds that might be affecting pathways that might help specifically with progressive MS and neurodegeneration. So at the Cleveland Clinic, we're privileged because in association with IBM, we have a quantum computer. And one of the goals of the quantum computing core is to actually analyze different compounds and how they react in different animals and in vitro models, and to look for signals of potential pathways that they may be hitting on. The old way of doing this is for a scientist to sit on the lab bench and try to figure this out somewhat mechanistically. The more modern systems biology design actually allows you to look at a system with much greater complexity and predict which are the compounds that are going to be most effective. Once you've identified compounds, you can also think about how AI might help us design trials. And this is something that has been somewhat of a challenge, particularly in progressive MS, where we select a specific outcome as a primary endpoint, and our trial does or does not meet. And it happens in our trials that many of those patients might not develop those outcomes of interest, or it could be that the therapeutic compound is affecting one outcome measure more than another. And so using a smart clinical trial type design, you can actually have artificial intelligence select individual groups of patients or groups of patients that are responding differently to medications, and have outcomes that still might be beneficial for the patient and not necessarily hanging things just on a single outcome. So those are two specific ways where I think artificial intelligence may play a big role in clinical trials. Certainly, there are others, a variety, also helping and assisting with smart clinical trial design, selecting the appropriate amount of patients to be included in each arm and for comparisons, and when, for example, to switch patients between arms as another potential application.
I mean, that's quite a range of potential benefits. Do you think we're actually seeing that happening now, or are we looking a bit more to the future?
Yeah, so I think we're probably not seeing it at this moment. But I think one of the things that AI has taught us in this day and age is that the development of these processes is much quicker than they were previously. So in the past, we said, well, we have a research technique that we want to implement. It might take 10 years before you actually see it implemented in a trial. I think with big data and AI, you might see these coming to fruition much, much sooner.
That's a good point. Can I move on to another topic, Dan, which is using AI in the actual diagnosis of MS? Do you think it has a potential role? I'll come back to you, Arman, in a minute, but just wondered what you think, Dan.
Yeah, we've done a little bit of work in this regard. And, historically, we've made a diagnosis of MS based on, the presence of symptoms and signs. And we've used additional paraclinical testing, laboratory testing, and also MRI testing to make a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. And I think AI is really an ideal place in which to use for applications in diagnosis. Specifically, we've done work with MRI, and one can imagine that if you have MRI of, 6,000 people with multiple sclerosis, and you have MRIs of 6,000 people without multiple sclerosis, you can train a machine to find features that are suggestive of MS. And this goes beyond just what, a lesion might look like to the naked eye. This involves kind of the underlying tissue pattern that is seen in MRI that many times is not visible when we look at an MRI, but a computer is able to pick that up. And, this has the ability of also saving time. But I wanted to go back to the point of assistive intelligence. And this is where things get a little bit tricky because people kind of are concerned. And I think one of the things of the diagnostic criteria is that generally when we're trying to make a diagnosis, it's a yes or no. Does this person have multiple sclerosis? Yes or no. And the way I think of AI being applied for diagnosis is not so much as a yes-no, but more of this is the likelihood that this person's MRI looks like a person who has MS. And if you add spinal fluid, and if you add symptoms, and if you add a variety of different things, you can potentially get to a prediction that will assist, you in the room with the patient to make a diagnosis. And, at the more granular level, we've been doing a lot of work with central vein. And central veins are small veins transfer through lesions. And, it is somewhat painful to count every single lesion on an MRI to determine if it has a vein or not and creating a percentage. But we have several models, and some of them have already been published, of how we can identify these central veins, and we can also identify paramagnetic rims in a fully automated method, which saves time, and the actual accuracy is very similar to human reading. And I think that's just an example of how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, no, it's a really good example. I suppose the other point I was thinking as you were talking is the other concern with the current diagnostic criteria is making the wrong diagnosis, a misdiagnosis. I mean, I guess what you've just said also suggests that AI could have a role in reducing misdiagnosis.
Yeah, I agree. If you embed, or if you bed into your AI inputs stuff that is very specific for MS, you can protect against that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful.
Yeah, and here, Alan, I can add one more thing is about the earlier diagnosis of MS, even before patients are referred for MRI. There are works being done where, for example, by looking back, at least in the UK, where patients are initially referred through their GPs before they are referred to these tertiary services, looking at the pattern of interaction with the healthcare system, as has been shown before in MS during the prodromal phase. There is a lot of potential there. There's a lot of work done by Sergio Baranzini's group, where they look back at the records to look at the patterns of change before MS is diagnosed.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, as you're in full flow, Arman, I want to ask you one or two clinical questions, and I think this is a little more difficult. But do you see any way in which patients with MS could use AI to improve their lives? Another broad question, but
yes, I start from broadly how. Again, AI does have lots of societal implications on how it's used now by the members of the public. The past 2 years, we've seen the rise of, again, large language models that are, for example, ChatGPT is one of the many examples. There are lots of others, Gemini from another company, or Claudia, or others, is simply, looking at them as chatbots. So as Dan mentioned, thinking as them, kind of a search engine where you can get, in a way, summarized answers instead of doing the search yourself. You can ask these chatbots. That's used by almost everyone. It's not necessarily specific to MS, and there are lots of concerns regarding the accuracy of those answers. But I think we are on a path to get to the somewhere that makes it very easy to digest a lot of data. And based on top of that, when I say digesting a lot of data, that would, for example, for patients, would pave the way in near future, where you can get access to your own data, but understand it in a way that might be very difficult to, or a neurologist may not have enough or sufficient time to go through years of MRIs and reports done. And that can be somehow, using AI as an assistive technology. So we do have in our hospital at UCLH, at UCL, patients can log in and look at or interact with the healthcare team or look at the records. I do see a future where patients can ask questions about their own data. And it's been shown, for example, in research in internal medicine, where using AI to simplify the medical jargon for patients, improve the understandability score that patients use it to grade that. There are other areas, for example, also as mentioned from clinical trials, where the remote monitoring can be done in the future, and also as assistive technologies when patients have motor or cognitive disabilities that can help, for example, to plan a day and similar functions.
Okay, well, let me move on, and then I might bring you in on this time as well. But Arman, what do you think the challenges are in developing AI for clinical care in MS? And as clinicians, what are our duties and responsibilities to ensure future AI-based decisions actually benefit our patients?
I just want to echo what Dan mentioned. There's little really done or being done in clinical care using AI, specifically for MS, something that can concretely say AI is used in clinical care. Having said that, when you look at the regulatory approved devices by FDA in the United States, there are at least 10, perhaps 15 medical devices that can be used, for example, for reporting MRIs and how what we call lesions or plaques, they report, for example, how they change over time. But getting regulatory approval is one thing, and impacting or influencing patient care is a different thing. So I think the first responsibility for us is to look at the ways that this can be used for to saving costs, improving the quality of care for patients, and eventually improving the quality of life for patients. Again, that requires a lot of research, how that can be implemented. But I do see that to have an impact in the next few years.
Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to our final question, which refers back to some of the points you've made earlier, actually. So, AI can be seen as a little bit of a black box to many people, clinicians and patients. And I just wondered how you think AI could be made a little bit more accessible and understandable for clinicians and people with MS.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it really highlights some of the difficulties that people have in adopting AI. And I think the reality is that many times when we create these models, and when we execute AI, it's not clear exactly where a decision-making process may be coming from. And that might be unsettling both for a patient and for a clinician. And I think that's where it's important for us as we develop these tools to make sure that in tandem with the development of the tool, we also have tools that also show and demonstrate how the decision-making process is being made. What are the inputs that are being used that drive the decision-making? And by doing that, we're actually also training our familiarity with new patterns that AI might be discovering. And then we kind of incorporate those into our kind of knowledge of the disease. And then finally, I think the other thing that we have to think about is, many times we think of developing different therapeutic strategies and interventions specifically for multiple sclerosis. But I think that AI might be a little bit different in this sense, as everyone is using AI for a lot of different applications. It could be that applications that are used to, make your phone more accessible or to make your car a better driving vehicle autonomously will be incorporated into how we take care of patients, how we deal with people with disabilities. And so the rigid framework of MS versus non-MS and research versus clinical and FDA approvals, I think eventually will probably need to be rethought and to make it a little bit more extensive.
That's an interesting thought for the future. Well, look, thank you, Arman and Dan, and thanks everyone for listening. Once again, I'm Alan Thompson, host of the podcast series and editor-in-chief of the MS Journal, the official journal of ECTRIMS. The ECTRIMS podcast is produced and hosted in collaboration with two key partners, the MS Journal, a peer-reviewed international journal that focuses on MS, neuromyelitis optica, and other related autoimmune diseases of the CNS, and MS Translate, an independent resource centre that aims to simplify the complex wealth of information about MS for the greater MS community. The ECTRIMS podcast is supported by an educational grant from Novartis AG, Hoffmann La Roche AG, and Alexion Pharmaceuticals. Educational grant providers have no input on the podcast series content. You can read more about the topic of this latest podcast episode and more on the ECTRIMS website, ECTRIMS EU. Do subscribe to the ECTRIMS podcast on your favorite podcast channels and follow ECTRIMS on X, formerly known as Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube.